Our next speaker is an economic democracy in Maine. It's Jackimovicz, and he's going to talk about economic democracy. Thank you, Alex.
I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the Wabanaki peoples who have lived in this region for thousands of years and whose presence continues to center and ground our collective interactions with the ecosystems that we are a part of, with the land and with the water and beings which reside here. They are the original custodians of the land and of the water. Attorney General Janet Mills' actions, her legal actions, and the Office of the Attorney General against the Penobscot Nation continue what rightfully must be called a legacy of racism and colonialism toward Indigenous peoples by challenging and reinterpreting the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act against Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. And she does this in our name, as if we, the people of Maine, sanction this. We all have a responsibility to understand, address, and change this. It's an honor to be speaking in front of you here today where the theme is protecting our collective sovereignty, defending land, water, on this first day of the legislative session. I've spent a number of years as a volunteer activist and organizer, chiefly concerned with issues of economic and social justice in Maine, with issues of trade policy. Actually, I work with Cynthia Finney, and resisting the seemingly inevitable wave of corporate control washing over every part of life, which has now taken over nearly every aspect of national government policy decision-making. I'm here before you today to speak briefly about a vision moving toward community self-reliance, community economy, sovereignty of the people, where our voices aren't just heard in the halls of power, but are the determining factors. This is about moving towards economic democracy in Maine. Thanks. To preface this, I feel like we are all here today because there's a great crisis in our country, which we have heard echoed in some of our previous speakers. And even in our state, based in a lack of having this meaningful democracy. The most important decisions in our society often go against the collective interests of the people in Maine, as well as nationally, whether they be at the various levels of government or the corporate halls of power. We're here today to assert our own voices and to be heard in these halls of power. There's a bridge between the work of sovereignty around water, around control of resources, and economic policy to the greater need to have an economy and politics that works for everyone without anyone being left behind. This bridge is the movement to have a true democracy which does not yet exist in the United States. The conventional meaning of democracy means the rule of the people, where the people collectively have real sovereignty and the important decisions in society and in government reflect their desires and interests. Let's point out the obvious without going into all the reasons why, because there's no time, with the mythic version of democracy that this is not what we have. I think that the essence of democracy, the rule of the demos, literally means the rule of the people. Now, the rule of the people cannot take place unless the economy is in the people's hands. It is accountable to the people. It is for the people. Economic power is vested with them. That is the primary essence of economic democracy. This is a fundamental departure from the theory of democracy that we are taught in textbooks This shift to have real democracy where people have the decision-making power over policy and our economic lives must include a movement towards economic democracy instead of just having it as a political democracy, where we don't even have a functional political democracy anymore. What can and should that world begin to look like, where the decision-making power is in our hands? How much of activism and organizing work ever gets to promote a vision and structure towards those ends and strategizes around what must come next to replace a system where a select few get to make most of the important decisions in our society? Progressives generally want a kinder or gentler version of reform, and their ideas basically end there. This view of economic democracy isn't just a kind of a traditional merging of theory and practice with a democratization of the economy to include worker-owned cooperatives, worker-run cooperatives, or just a relocalization of industries, especially with food, water, energy infrastructure, which are all vitally important. We're facing huge crises for the lack of these. Essential goods could and should be made more locally if there was political and economic will, but this isn't the real essence. This isn't just a democratization of the economy. Rather, this notion of economic democracy is embedded with the notion that we all share responsibility for all the members of society, all beings. We are moving together, and we recognize it is, whether we recognize it now or in several hundred years, our true relationship with each other and to each other is one of a universal family. We are a big family, and no one should be left behind. We need an economy where all voices are heard and get the opportunity to develop and flourish. We aren't going to accept that some of our family members are being exploited and denied opportunities and privileges that others of us may have. This economic democracy leads to a vision where our economy is for the betterment and welfare of all beings. I'm involved in a conference that is themed on this economic democracy, at least in the planning stages. And I'm just going to mention a couple more things before I give way to the next set of speakers. We've come here today and we're trying to figure out what kind of world do we need where we have the sustainability, where we have the decision-making power, where the most important decisions that vitally affect our lives, they're in our hands. How do we get that? What does that world look like? Well, at the start of it, if we have a real democracy, a real people's economy, a real community economy, the needs of every member of society, food, education, shelter, access to nutritious water, food, clean water, nutritious food, health care, that should be a necessity guaranteed to all members of society. And how do we get there? Do we depend on government welfare to get there? No, we don't. We have to develop the purchasing capacity of every person in the state. The big discussion about economic democracy is how do we get to that point? I would love to invite you all to talk with us in the fall, to join us in that conversation as we have this conference. And you can talk to me after if you would like to be on an email list that gets some updates. As I said, for there to be an actual economic democracy, all members must have the requirements, their essential needs met. A second requirement is that people get their needs and their requirements met through a gradually increasing purchasing capacity where they're not dependent upon others for their own welfare. Thirdly, economic decisions must be in local hands where production is centered to the extent possible and reasonable. Fourthly, there shouldn't be interference by outsiders in the local economy. There should not be a drainage of capital. These are a few main points. Thank you so much. You can talk to me afterwards, or perhaps Larry Dansinger, who's also part of the organizing team of the Economic Democracy Conference.